Hi, I'm Joanna. Just about a year ago, I left my old neighborhood. It wasn't so much the house that was the issue, but rather the environment. I remember the day I moved there. The first thing my husband did was put on new locks on all the windows and doors. After a week of staying there, we didn't have a choice but to install guardrails outside the windows. My husband always warned me to check the peephole and never to open the door unless I really knew who was out there. There were all sorts of people and all sorts of crime happening. Burglaries, break-ins were almost daily news. And in a neighborhood like this, it was stressful raising a 16-year-old daughter and a 10-year-old son. My husband and I would interchange in dropping them off to school and picking them up every day. After a month of living there, I thought perhaps getting to know the neighbors would be a good idea rather than being all alone. That's when I met Mr. and Mrs. Crowley. They were an elderly couple in their mid-40s, and they seemed like decent people. Mr. and Mrs. Crowley were always very happy and cheerful. There wasn't an instance I could remember that I saw a frown on their face. Oftentimes I would open the door to Mrs. Crowley, who would bring over cookies and cake. And then one night, she even invited my family over for dinner. Over the weeks, Mrs. Crowley started coming over more often, and I got quite close to her. Sometimes, she would wait it out to meet the kids before she went back home. I thought the woman felt lonely, so I was never rude to her, although it did come to a point where I didn't always appreciate her sudden visits. And in all this, I started to notice something that began to bother me. Mrs. Crowley would peek out her curtains and watch me as I brought my kids back home. And then it was one evening I found her talking to Richard by our gate. "What are you so smiley about? What was she telling you?" "Oh, nothing. Asking me to come over." "Asking you to come over?" "She was just being nice." "Nice? Or flirting with you?" "What? She's an old woman, Joanna." "Not old enough." I assumed I was just being suspicious of the woman for no reason. The truth was, she had always been nice and treated me and my family with lots of love and affection. But on another afternoon, I found Mrs. Crowley leaning over our fence and talking to my son and my daughter. "Emma, what was she talking about with you guys?" "She just came to say hi. She kept on telling Emma she's pretty, and she looks a lot like Dad." "Is that so? You know what? Next time, don't talk to her so much." "She was just being nice, Mom. She even gave us candy." "Don't eat that." I really started to get annoyed of Mrs. Crowley, but it seemed everyone else in the family had only good things to say about her. "Don't you think Mrs. Crowley is a little nosy and kind of annoying? It's like whenever she comes, I can't get her to leave." "Yeah, she's a little lonely, but they're nice people. Why don't you go over sometimes and give her company?" "Right, like I have the time." The next day, after bringing the kids home from school, John took my cell phone and ran off to his room to play games as usual. Emma was in her room listening to music, and I was getting dinner prepared. It was around 8. I was startled seeing Mrs. Crowley waiting right outside my kitchen back door. When did she come in? How long has she been standing there? I quickly opened the door to her smiling as wide as she could, a dish of lasagna in her hands. "Hello, Joanna. I made my special lasagna recipe. Thought I'd bring some over." "Oh, you didn't have to." Mrs. Crowley rather barged inside and placed the dish on the table. She looked at the mess in the kitchen. "Looks like you could use a helping hand." No, Mrs. Crowley, I'll manage on my own." "No, I insist." Mrs. Crowley began helping out, cleaning and chopping up the vegetables. As we got talking, I asked her, "Mrs. Crowley, do you have any children?" As soon as I asked, Mrs. Crowley's smile faded away. "No, dear. It remains a dream." It turned out Mrs. Crowley was unable to conceive, and she and her husband had tried everything in their power, but starting a family for them just wasn't meant to be. I regretted bringing up the topic, and I tried to lighten the mood. I packed up some dinner for Mr. and Mrs. Crowley and walked her back to our house that night. When I got back home, I called the kids down for dinner. They hurriedly swallowed their food and ran back upstairs. Around 10 that night, I realized John had been with my cell phone the whole time. I went upstairs to make sure he was in bed and found both Emma and John sleeping in their bedrooms. The cell phone was laying on John's bed. I picked it up and browsed through to make sure everything was how I had it. I noticed a few minor changes, the theme, the background. John had given me a new ringtone. I decided to get to bed myself and rest until Richard would return. As I lay in bed, I fiddled on my phone, checking the pictures John had taken. I couldn't help but smile at his cute face as he made the funniest expressions and continuously snapped selfies. It was the last picture in the folder, however, that made my heart start to pound. I couldn't believe my eyes. I thought my eyes were just playing tricks on me. It was a picture of John sleeping on his bed, and I would have assumed Emma had taken the picture. But in the left corner, it seemed like a woman's face had been cut off from the snapshot. I looked closely and noticed a familiar earring. Was it Mrs. Crowley wearing earrings like this? It's her. I was terrified. All this time, my suspicions were true. This woman is insane. When did she come up to the room? She was with me the whole time she was here. Did she sneak in afterwards? Richard got home. I showed him the picture immediately. "Are you sure that's her?" "Richard, you know that's her." But Richard just shrugged it off and said, "So what if it was Mrs. Crowley? Maybe she just wanted to spend time with the kids." "Like this? I never saw her go upstairs, Richard. She broke into the house." After a long conversation, I was able to convince Richard that we weren't safe. And although he didn't think it was because of the Crowleys, he agreed to look for a new place. We spent a big portion of our savings to move to this house. Mr. and Mrs. Crowley were really upset that we were moving out. They tried to convince us to stay, but I didn't let the words get to Richard. It's been about 2 weeks here, and so far, things have been fine. And there isn't anything that I could say seems to be odd. Organizing the house, I suddenly flinched to a loud knocking on the door. I opened up to find John sweating, jumping in anxiety. He stuttered and choked as he kept pointing towards the road. Tried to calm him down and hear out what he said. Mom, they took Emma. In the car. They pulled her in, Mom." "Who?" "I don't know. I couldn't see them properly. ran out the gate and barely saw a car speed down the road and turn around the curb. I called the police immediately and pulled out my own car. I tried to follow the vehicle, but I lost sight of it. Hopelessly returning home, I got hold of John. John, tell me exactly what happened. Emma and I were playing ball and I kicked the ball out on the road. She went to get it and a car drove up. The windows were shaded so I couldn't see, but I saw Emma talking with someone in the driver's seat. And before anything, the back door opened and someone pulled her inside and drove off. My husband and I called the cops and explained everything. They haven't been any help. I've been on the hunt since that day. I want my daughter back. I don't know anything other than how the car looked. I wasn't able to note down the license plate number. I know it could have been anybody, but I have a strange feeling the Crowleys are involved. I can never forget that she broke into my house before. She sneaked on my kids. So the next day, I decided to go to Mrs. Crowley's house. I don't know what I expected to find there, but I had to get rid of the suspicion. When I knocked on the door, I saw Mrs. Crowley peer out the curtains. Her face broke out into a smile as she hurried to open the door. She came out and wrapped her arms around me. "I'm so glad you came to visit. You're not going to believe what I'm going to tell you." "What is it?" Mrs. Crowley put her hand on her stomach. "I'm expecting." I was surprised by the news from a woman her age, but I congratulated her. "That's great news, Mrs. Crowley." But Mrs. Crowley sensed something was upsetting me. Is everything all right, Emma?" "Yes, it's fine." Mrs. Crowley seemed so happy. I didn't want to ruin the occasion for her. I didn't tell her about Emma. "Mrs. Crowley, would you mind if I use the restroom?" "Of course not, dear. It's right this way." I walked off to the bathroom, and a while later stepped out to find Mrs. Crowley in the kitchen. This was my opportunity. I admit, I felt a little ashamed for having doubts on Mrs. Crowley and coming to her house to spy on her, but I had to do this for my conscience. But I didn't find anything. After that day, I just let her be, and I never went there again. And now, it's been almost a year since my daughter has been missing, but I haven't lost hope. I know I'll find her. For the past 3 months, Mr. and Mrs. Crowley have been overjoyed with the coming of their first child. As Mrs. Crowley made her little one's first bowl of food, Mr. Crowley couldn't stop playing with his newborn. "Look how cute." Mrs. Crowley sat down and tried to feed her baby. "Come on now. You know you need to eat every spoon of it. Open your mouth. Here comes the airplane." Mr. and Mrs. Crowley was especially excited these days. I have a feeling the baby will talk soon. What do you think will be the first word? The two playfully betted over if it would be Mama or Dada. Mr. Crowley had even realized Mrs. Crowley had been crooning over and over. while she fed the baby. "Mama loves you. Mama's precious one." Sometimes she wasn't even subtle. "Say mama. Come on, say mama." The next morning, the couple surrounded the child with numerous toys as they noticed their child was making noises. Mrs. Crowley took out the ball from her child's mouth, and both the husband and wife went on babbling. "Mama, Dada, say mama, who's daddy's baby?" And their child finally spoke out. What do you want from me? What do you want from me? Let me go." Mrs. Crowley's smile faded. She ran out the room, bursting in tears. Mr. Crowley sighed, and with a heavy heart, he put the ball where it was, shut the lights, and locked the nursery door. "It's okay, honey. Maybe the next one will say mama first."
If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to my channel and share this video with your friends and family.